Okay, I can see people are still joining, but in the interest of time, let's start now. So hello, everyone. My name is Jing Liu. I am the Managing Director of Michigan Institute for Data Science at the University of Michigan. Together with my colleagues and organizers, who are the executive directors of other data science institutes, we want to welcome you to the first Data Science Coast to Coast seminar in 2021. Next slide, please. So this series is jointly hosted by Data Science Institutes at 7 universities. We have been planning ways to foster a broad-reaching data science community that can collaborate routinely to advance our missions for research, education, and data science for social good. In the next few months, we will host 5 seminars. Next slide, please. Each seminar will feature 1 faculty member and 1 postdoctoral fellow from 2 universities. Each speaker will give a talk about ongoing projects and motivating issues, followed by extensive discussion with the audience. We hope this format will lead to follow-on research discussion, which will lead to new collaborative research. The talks are grouped by themes, as you can see here. Next slide, please. So before I introduce today's speakers, I want to first give you a preview of next month's seminar on urban informatics by Aria Farahi, who is a Michigan Data Science Fellow, and Kate Starbird, a faculty member at the University of Washington. Next slide, please. So now we come to today's speakers. Lydia Kavraki will be our first speaker. She is the director of the Ken Kennedy Institute at Rice University and the Noah Harding Professor of Computer Science. She's a world-renowned robotics researcher. We can literally use the next hour to talk about her achievements and awards, so I will just mention a very few. In 2020, she received the ACM AAAI Alan Newell Award and the IEEE Robotics Pioneer Award. She's a member of the National Academy of Medicine, a fellow of ACM, AAAI, AAAS, the Academy of Athens, and the Academia Europaea. Lydia's research spans robotics, AI, and biomedicine. In robotics and AI, her research focus is to enable robots to work with people and support people in multiple contexts, such as in people's homes, in surgery, or even in space habitats. Her talk today is robotics in the data science era. Next slide, please. So the second speaker today is Angela Gradulescu, a Morris Sloan faculty fellow at the NYU Center for Data Science. Angela is a cognitive scientist studying how we learn from interaction with the environment and how learning can lead to changes in mental health. Her research combines computational approaches such as reinforcement learning and Bayesian inference, behavioral experiments, eye tracking, and neuroimaging. Today, her talk is towards naturalistic task representation in health and disease. So now I'm going to ask Lydia to share her screen. Audience members, you can put your questions in Q&A. At the end of both talks, we hope to have an extensive discussion with all the audience members.
Jing, can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Jing. And before starting my talk, I would like to congratulate you on your initiative to bring the data science community together across our different institutions. I have very much enjoyed the previous seminars, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to talk about the work of my team. So robotics. Robots have fascinated people since the antiquity. In ancient Greek mythology, Hephaestus, the god of technology, forged Talos. Talos was described as a giant bronze man, an automaton, endowed with superhuman health, who would guard the island of Crete for Crete's renowned king, King Minos. This is about 1500 BC. The myth was recorded extensively much later, around 700 BC, in coins, vase paintings, and frescoes. Various automata have been imagined through the ages by people such as Da Vinci, Descartes, by writers, poets, and painters. Actually, I said automata in my description because the word robot was not invented until 1921. It first appeared in a play written by Karel Čapek. It was called RUR, Rozum's Universal Robots. And the word comes from the Czech word robota, which means self-labor, hard work. In this play, actually, the robots are servants who at some point rebel against their masters. Now, fast forward 100 years later, actually it's 100 years, I found this article from the Wall Street Journal. The title is on the 100th anniversary of robot, the word robot. They're finally taking over. Well, are they? We'll discuss this a little bit. The picture is interesting here. It shows the first industrial robot. It was called Unimate, and it was installed at General Motors in 1961. So clearly, the robots are taking over several jobs in industrial automation. Let me be a little bit more precise here. There is no doubt there's a huge number of tasks that can be automated, some of which can be effectively done by robots. Although data has shown that in many sectors, when robotic automation was installed, new kinds of jobs were created in the same places. These were not the same jobs as before. So this is an important debate topic in the community with huge technological and social implications. For this talk, when you think about robots today, don't think only about industrial manipulators. Yes, of course, this is a kind of robot, but think also about Roombas. Think about autonomous or semi-autonomous cars that we may see in our streets pretty soon. Think about underwater vehicles that explore our seas. Think about drones that fly in our skies. Think about Perseverance. We now have a robot on a far distant planet, Mars, not only a robot, but also a robotic helicopter. And I hope you're following what is happening. We are all eagerly waiting to see what information we can get with Perseverance on Mars. And also think about robotic devices that have a kind of symbiotic relationship with humans. The top left shows the Da Vinci robot. It's controlled by a surgeon. It's not an autonomous robot, and it can give the surgeon extreme precision in any operations performed during surgery. Robotic wheelchairs. I very much like this robotic glove that can help people who have problems moving their upper extremities do fine manipulation tasks. So these are the kinds of robots I like to think about. When we talk about a robot, we have an embodied agent. Otherwise, we would be talking about software agents. So a robot interacts with the world. We have the environment, I mean, whatever it is. The robot needs to perceive this environment somehow, process this information, find its state, plan something reasonable in that environment, and then act. Okay, control its body, its hands, its legs to do something useful in the environment. I like to talk about sensors. I mean, it's an important part of robotics. I like to talk about, cognition. That's also an important part, and action. Okay, through the robot's feet, hands, body parts. I mean, these interact with the world. So I will very briefly touch upon these components: sensors, cognition, and action in the rest of this talk, and then try to bring it all together under the umbrella of data science. Let me start with sensors. In this slide, you are seeing a mobile robot that moves in a building. It didn't have a map of the building, but as it moves in the building, it constructs a map of this building and localizes itself in this map. We are calling this simultaneous localization and mapping. This robot has a laser rangefinder that can measure the distance between the sensor and the object that is being measured, here the walls. And here a simple 2D map of the world is constructed. It's not a very precise map, as you can see. It's not the CAD design that the architect of the building had, but it's good enough for the robot to perform a number of tasks in this environment. Let's go into 3D. This is actually a picture from my lab in the bottom left. And now I'm going to show you one of the robots that we have. It's called the Fetch Manipulator, and show you what this robot sees. This robot has a scanning rangefinder and what we call an RGBD sensor. This last sensor is a specific type of a depth sensing device that gives you back, let's say, an image with depth information. So depth information related to the sensor, and actually in a per pixel basis. So what the robot sees in this space is points, okay, points. It's very important to realize that we actually call these point clouds, okay? It's a bag of points, okay? This is not the kind of information that we see in the environment, right? This is very different. We don't, the robot does not see a nice image. The robot does not recognize tables and chairs and objects. We need to process this point clouds information to reconstruct the environment to understand what's going on. And in the map we're going to have at the end, it's not going to be perfect. It will have holes, it will have missing parts, and we have to make sense of all this information. Let me now move to the cognition part, where actually most of the work of my team is. A central point is the topic of motion planning. The classical version of the motion planning problem has a very clean statement. It considers a known environment, a robot, its properties and its constraints, and it finds a path to move the robot from a start to a goal configuration while avoiding all obstacles and respecting all constraints. For those of you who are interested, would like to see complexity results, I'm going to point out that very, very simple versions of these problems have actually very high complexity. And despite these pessimistic results, we have efficient solutions today for a large class of problems. I mean, how do we do this? Well, we abstract, we forget parts of the problem, we provide local solutions, we accept the fact that we may fail with some probability to produce a solution, even if one exists. In general, it's a trade-off between completeness of the solution and efficiency of the approach. Today, I would say that there are four main classes of approaches for solving the motion planning problem. And my group in particular has been involved in the development of sampling-based motion planning methods. And it has been very interesting over the years to see the evolution of these methods. These methods are about 15 years old by now. At a very high level, it's interesting to see how these methods work. They collect local information from the solution space and they try to put a solution together. This is a roadmap version of these algorithms, of these planners, what you see in this slide. Think about all these points as placement of the robot. I go there. Let me explore around here. Let me see if I can move around. Let me record this information and let me bring all this information together to get a roadmap. And then, of course, I can use it as a map and go from one place to another. And I may have a roadmap or I may have a tree. This is a tree version of the same planners. Same idea. Where can I go? Let me go here. Let me explore again. A trade-off between exploration and exploitation. There are many planners like this. And if I'm abstracting a lot, but if you would like to see details, there's an open source motion library that actually my group distributes, and you can get all the details. But these planners work and they work well in practice. So let me show you an example. Recently, we collaborated with Eduard Vital and the group of Marc Carreras in Spain. They have an autonomous underwater vehicle. The underwater domain presents several challenges and limitations. You don't have GPS. It's a unknown, unpredictable environment. Safety is paramount. You may have currents that affect the motion of the robot. You have a vehicle with nonlinear dynamics, several motion constraints, and importantly, very limited computational resources. In this case, actually, we only have a scanning profile sonar. And what we've done is work with this group to produce a planner with a layered design. First, we do a fast geometric path, and then as soon as we find information about the environment, we adapt. We start with a straight line path, as you can see in this video, and notice how the path changes as we discover the obstacles in the environment. The lead path biases to the sampling of a second motion planner, which is a planner that takes into account all the dynamic constraints of the vehicle. And we also had to impose strong safety guarantees by always allowing safety contingency maneuvers to the autonomous underwater vehicle. I'll give you now another scenario where robots can be helpful. This movie shows what astronauts do spend their time on, and at least spend considerable time on while they are on the space station. They have to clean rails, they have to disinfect, they have to throw away trash, they have to pack and unpack everything that they need because everything is stored in these cargo bags. So NASA is actually building a robot for cargo bag retrieval. It's called Robonauton, and it's shown on the right in this slide. The idea is very simple. This robot needs to be holding on a rail at all times, okay, because this is a zero-G environment. We don't want this robot to float around. And approach the storage bag container, remove the restraint, get the bag out, hold tight into this bag, right, because we don't want the bag to float in space. It is a constrained motion planning problem that we solve, and we have a number of techniques to create motion that respects the constraints. The simple animation here shows one constraint. The tip of the robot needs to be on the blue ellipse. But this is the kind of constraints that NASA would like us to consider. And Zach Kingston is one of my students who has worked a lot on this problem. And this is what we show here is some action experiments with Robonauton, not in space, but in the bay of the NASA Johnson Space Center. The Robonaut is suspended by a black apparatus. It looks like a crane. This simulates a zero gravity environment. So the video on the left shows Robonaut turning a valve with the hands doing a circular motion. The video on the right shows it pushing a door that separates two modules with the hand executing a straight line path. Very interesting questions arise in this environment. If the robot moves in the same space, wouldn't similar jobs, wouldn't it be interesting to collect information about the job that it does and then use them again when the robot is asked to do a similar job? Can the robot learn from experience? And actually, Konstantinos Hamzas, another one of my students, is working on this problem, and indeed he shows that even with noisy data, because remember, bookcases do not look smooth and shiny to the robot. He shows that he can collect noisy data, but he can store this data and intelligently retrieve them to speed up the planning of the motion of the robot in similar environments. And we have managed to move into more complex scenarios or missions. It's very nice to be able to specify a mission for the robot and to have our robot automatically execute it. Here is an example of a mission. We have 3 cans on a table. We want to put them in a bin and then push the bin. And the video shows the robot actually executing this task. I don't want to specify, however, where exactly are the cans, which one to pick up first, which one to pick up second. The specification, the interpretation, and the execution of a mission is actually an active area of research. And it gets much more interesting when a human is involved. Here, the task of the robot is to build an arc with 2 black blocks, 2 white blocks as supports, and then a black block on the top. And in this scenario, we know how to execute that. It's a complex mission. We know how to do that. But in this scenario, we also have a human in the loop who may help the robot or may decide to perform an action that does not help the overall task. And then what do you do? How do you perceive the environment? What kind of guarantees can you provide that the task will be completed? I'll show you a very short video that illustrates this task, and the human helping the robot first, by stacking the black box, but then removing a white box from the arc, and then the robot had to actually figure out that it needs to take the black block back to its place and then complete the arc. So in general, these scenarios can get very complex, and it is a topic of active research today. Let me go back now to my picture and say something about actuation, because this is very important in my opinion. And actually, the only thing I want to say is that it is very, very important. I mean, sensors and cognitions are not enough unless you have reliable actuation. And we're very lucky today. There have been tremendous strides in the development of robotic hardware. Robotic hands we're talking about soft robotic hands today. They can be very gentle when they touch something. We have different kinds of arms. We have different kind of wheels, different kind of legs for the robots. It's just very exciting. It's only very recent that we are having all this hardware that is available. So now the problem is becoming very, very interesting, because we are at an era where things have progressed. I mean, and sensing, cognitions, and actuation has progressed. And our robots are much more capable than they were before. By now, I hope you've realized that robots are amazing data collectors. They're very precise and actually much better at collecting data than humans. I told you about how a robot localizes itself in a map. It knows its precise coordinates, yes, with some error, but much better than I would do if I move around the campus. I would probably have an error of several feet. The robot will have an error of a few inches. So imagine a robot that moves constantly inside the building. This robot is capable of obtaining measurements about noise level, about temperature, humidity, air quality, Wi-Fi signal strength, I mean, you name it, vital signs of buildings, vital signs of spaces. And the robots can constantly update semantic maps, either in a small scale, imagine a building, or in a large scale, imagine a city. And actually, we have several examples. I did a very, very quick search while I was preparing for this talk. I could find many examples, measuring temperature and noise for retrofitting buildings, for example, inspecting and collecting vital signs in the COVID-19 pandemic, and many, many other such examples can be found in the literature. And it's not only that one robot can do this. Now our robots are networked, or will be soon networked. So we know about the Internet of Things and sensors and how this can be embedded in smart homes, smart cities, but robots take this concept to a completely new level. With robots, we are talking about active data collection. All right. Robots can use their reasoning to seek missing data and learn about their environment. So they can find data that they can also find data that may not be obtainable with other sensors. For example, an image cannot reveal if an object is heavy or not. So we already see a lot of progress using robots as active data collectors. I found examples for in agriculture, helping farmers manage large crops, flying robots that can actively inspect infrastructure, robots that inspect pollution, and many others. So in fact, in robotics, many of us believe that interaction and active perception enabled by robotic systems will allow us to look at data and actually in the extraction of knowledge from data in different ways. New kinds of data will be coming from interactive embodied systems, allowing us new kinds of inference. Robots with multitask capabilities, including social capabilities, will collect very different data than passive sensors, which means that we will need new systems, new methodologies for transforming this data to knowledge, which I think has broader implications for data science. And I will conclude my talk here. I want to acknowledge the people in my team, students and collaborators, and I would like to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you very much.
So Angela, please feel free to share your screen and start from here.
Yep, sounds good. Can you see me? Okay. Can you see my slides okay?
Looks good.
Great, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks so much, Lydia, for this wonderful presentation that I think has amazing synergies with hopefully with what I'm about to talk about today. So I'm a faculty fellow at the NYU Center for Data Science. I was trained as a psychologist, but I'm broadly interested in methods that enable us to understand how people represent tasks in naturalistic environments, and how this understanding can translate into clinical insights that may help us come up with better therapies for different psychiatric diseases. So the emerging field of computational psychiatry brings data science tools to bear on the way that mental illness is studied, classified, and managed. I specifically focus on reinforcement learning approaches to computational psychiatry. And the broad vision in the field is that by collecting data from different decision-making tasks, which in humans typically entail a multi-armed bandit setup where people make repeated choices between options, and they get feedback, and they learn from experience which options to choose in the future. By studying these tasks, the idea is that we can build forward models of participant behavior, which can predict what people will choose, how fast they will choose it, where they will look, various self-report measures, and so on. And one advantage of this approach is that we get to look inside the black box and infer latent variables that we may not otherwise have access to. So we may be able to measure how compulsive someone is or how their mood fluctuates in real time. And the hope is that we can make therapeutic decisions based on such a model, and then remeasure the behavior and reinfer these variables and study how they actually unfold in real time on the timescale of a participant's individual experience. Now, this approach has been extremely fruitful in various ways, but it's been rather slow to translate into major advances in treatment. And part of the reason is that almost all reinforcement learning tasks that are currently being used and studied in computational psychiatry assume these clearly defined representations of the external environment. So on this slide, I'm showing you a toy example in which someone may have to choose between option A and option B. Now, in real-world environments, decision-making is very different. So decision-making may look something more like this. So this is Times Square before the COVID pandemic. You can see that any decision maker in this setting would have to deal with rich multidimensional input, continuous feedback, and would have to somehow deal with the fact that no two situations are exactly the same. So to behave well, or to behave in a way that is in accordance with one's goals, we have to focus on parts of scenes like this. We have to, for example, in this case, maybe I want to focus on signs pointing me to the subway. Or we may have to remember relevant information from the past, like past trips I may have taken to Times Square. There are actually clues in the literature that such cognitive biases and cognition is basically a key diagnostic dimension. Distorted cognitive representations are some of the most robust effects that we observe, for example, in mood disorders. There's a well-documented phenomenon in depression that people tend to pay more attention to negative information. There's also evidence that people deploy attention in a way that is mood congruent. So when we're in a good mood, we tend to pay more attention to positive features or tend to remember more positive features, and vice versa when we're in a negative mood. So I'm broadly interested in how humans learn to represent naturalistic environments. And the advantage of studying more naturalistic environments, and I'll show you what I mean later on, is that we actually have to think about how cognitive processes like attention and memory interact with learning and decision-making in service of goal attainment. So in a first project I'm going to talk about today, I studied the role of attention in this kind of task representation. And the broad question that my collaborators and I were interested in is, how does attention constrain learning? So what we did is put human participants in front of this decision-making task in which they had to make repeated choices between different options that varied along multiple features. People got feedback after every choice, and these features were common across different situations and changed, but they stayed constant over time. And the question is, does attention, in the psychological sense, does it actually constrain the features that people learn about and make decisions based on? Now, to answer this question, we developed a method for doing what we call real-time attentional decoding. So the idea is that when people make decisions in these environments, we don't actually know what features drove their decisions. But one thing we can do is actually measure their attention to different parts of the environment. And we did this in two ways. We took advantage of findings in human neuroscience that suggest that different parts of the brain represent different stimulus categories like faces, houses, and tools. And we also used eye tracking in order to measure what features of the environment people paid attention to during each experience. And this enabled us to construct an index of where people were attending to on what we call a trial by trial basis. So every time that a participant makes a decision, we know what aspects of the environment they paid attention to. And what we can then do is build computational models that test different hypotheses about how attention may interact with learning and decision making in this setting. Now, in this case, we were interested in asking the question, does attention actually help? So we took the empirical measure of attention, we took the empirical measure of attention and we augmented cognitive models with this measure, as essentially creating different hypotheses about how attention may interact with learning and choice. The first such model assumed uniform attention, that is, people pay attention to all features in the environment, both when they make decisions and when they learn. The second model, which we called attention at choice, assumes that people choose based on some features but ignore others, right? So when you're deciding what restaurant to go to, you may pay more attention to the cuisine or to the chef rather than to the location. The third model assumed that attention interacts with how people learn and how they integrate feedback into their knowledge. So when you have the experience of going to a restaurant, you may learn more about the type of food that you ate rather than the person that you were with. And the fourth model assumed that attention actually influences both choices and how we learn from those choices. And we could use all of these models to make predictions in real time about what choices people made during the task. And long story short, what we found was that attention actually influences both our choices and the way that we integrate feedback about our choices. So we only pay attention to certain features, both when we decide what to do and when we incorporate feedback on the world about how good our actions were. Now, the second part of this project involved building a model of how attention is determined in the first place. So it would be very interesting to know how a person actually directs their attention to different features of the environment in light of ongoing experience. And to answer this question, we can study attention dynamics with eye tracking. And when we did that, we found two things. We found that attention is sparse, that is, people tend to focus on few features at a time, and attention switches rapidly. When someone pays attention to one of the features, they might maintain attention to that feature for some period of time, but then quickly switch to a different one, as experiences unfold. So this led us to formulate a model of attention as sampling. So these patterns suggest that what people do in these tasks is sample hypotheses about what the correct task representation may be, and adjust those hypotheses based on evidence, and then direct attention in accordance to their internal representation of the task. And we can formalize this process as a form of statistical inference. So the assumption here is that each time the person takes an action, it gets back an observation. And in our task, the observation consists of what the features that the person chose, as well as a reward. And this observation is determined by some true state of the world, which is not necessarily accessible to the person, which in this case is the identity of what the target feature, what the relevant feature of the tasks actually are. And at any given point in time, the agent can approximate the state of the task using a single hypothesis from a set of candidate features. So for example, here, the model is thinking about George Clooney as like being more predictive of reward than any other features in the task. It can then store observations in memory and use that memory cache to compute a distribution for what alternative representations might actually be useful. And then we can sample new representations from this memory augmented distribution. And depending how consistent recent observations are with its current hypothesis and its current interpretation of the task, it might stick with that or sample a new hypothesis. And then it may direct attention in accordance to this hypothesis up to some noise. So you can think of this as exploration in attention space. So what we did here is set up a model comparison, not for what participants actually chose, but for their gaze pattern as they performed the task. And one previous account of how attention may be learned suggested that attention is kind of like a habit in the sense that it can also be learned from trial and error. And our model presented this alternative view that attention is more like an inference process where we sample information from the environment in a piecemeal manner and then redirect our attention as we switch hypotheses about what features of the environment might be relevant. So we pit these two models against each other. And in both cases, we also accounted for the bias that people have to look at certain parts of the screen, in this case, the center. And what we found is that gaze dynamics measured with eye tracking were more consistent with this inference model than with trial and error learning, which suggested that attention to features of a task is not updated by through gradual trial and error learning, but through this fast inference process about what features of the task may actually be relevant. Now, in this project, we're still in this regime where we're studying essentially multi-arm bandits in which people are making choices between stimuli that have a very well-defined representation of the environment. So the question is, can we translate some of these insights to more naturalistic environments? And to do that, we can take advantage of new platforms based on, and particularly in this case, we can think about virtual reality as a good test bed that kind of sits in between these more constrained lab experiments and the real life environments in which humans may actually learn how to behave. So in this project, our focus was visual search, which is a behavior that's been studied a lot in artificial lab settings. It has a long history in psychology. And typical psychology tasks that focus on visual search look a lot like the task on the left, right? So here, you're supposed to find a T among all these L's. I'll give you a second. Now, of course, in real world environments, visual search looks a lot more like the situation on the right. So here is, for example, you might have to find your keys in a cluttered bedroom. And you can hopefully see that these two settings are very different and put very different constraints on the kinds of information sampling algorithms that people might have to use in order to accomplish their goal. So we developed a paradigm called immersive goal-directed search. So people are put in these virtual reality environments, and they're shown an object that they have to search for. For example, in this case, the person on the left was asked to look for the pizza box. Then the participant is teleported into a virtual room in which many objects may be scattered around, and they have 8 seconds to find the object that they're looking for. And in this case, I think the participant was very quick in finding the pizza box. And what we found that was it's somewhat surprising in light of what we know about lab visual search paradigms is that people are actually really good at this. So the environment is quite complex, right? There's a multitude of features that people could pay attention to. But for most, for all scenes that we studied, people were very fast in finding the target, and they found a target 75% of the time. So this begs the question of how do humans know how to sample information in order to reach the goal? And here's an example of what their sampling patterns look like, which we can, of course, as before, we can measure with eye tracking. So this person here started looking at the horizon, and then they immediately oriented to objects on the couch. Then they started looking at the floor and they did the sweep on the floor, and then they finally found a target on the right table. And what's neat about data like these is that for each of these data points, we get very rich and different annotations, including contextual cues like the couch, the wall, but also objects and features of objects. And what we can do is then build models that treat each eye movement as a decision about which parts of the environment to sample. So the assumption that we're making is that the state representation that the model maintains consists of beliefs about objects and their features. And the agent gets to either sample information from an object location, or it can terminate search. It can decide that it found what it was looking for. And what sampling does is before, it's allowing the agent to get more data about the true state of the world and update its beliefs. But we also have to make this additional assumption that sampling is costly. So you don't want to move your eyes if you don't have to, because it might be difficult, or you might have other things to do, other tasks to solve. And you have to optimally include this cost of sampling in the benefit that you get from taking additional samples. Now, terminating the search process leads to reward if the most probable target, given what the agent actually thinks is the target, matches the true target. So the approach we take here is to train reinforcement learning agents to solve this optimal planning problem, and to solve this planning problem and ask whether the learned policies are optimal and whether they actually match human gaze behavior. Now, to actually instantiate the model in virtual reality, we have to make some additional assumptions about what the feature space is for object search. And to do this, we took inspiration from human cognitive science, from where we know that when people have a goal, that induces a space of object features that are attended to in a top-down manner. And in this case, we focused on two features just as proof of concept. So we focused on shape and color. And we took each object rendered in virtual reality and measured the shape of that particular object and its color. And when we trained reinforcement learning agents over this state representation that includes information about color and shape, we got some preliminary evidence that people's sampling policies are actually in line with the policy that the model learns. So here at the top, I'm showing you 8 gaze trajectories from the learned policy of the agents. And at the bottom are actual empirical trajectories from the 8 participants who searched in this particular scene under this particular configuration. And people's sampling patterns, while much noisier, actually show similar temporal structure to those that the model has learned. And we can summarize these trajectories by asking which objects were sampled most by both people and agents. And here the goal was to find this green box that I'm showing on the left. And hopefully you can see that both agents and humans tend to get distracted by similar kinds of objects. So they get distracted by this green mug and the green cylinder and the green book and so on. And these are objects that are similar to the target. Using this approach, we can ask an additional question, which is relevant particularly for human behavior, which is which features of the state actually guide sampling. So here we conducted a model ablation study in which we took out shape and color in turn, and we asked which of these features are more likely to help us predict where humans are going to look. And we actually found that for these environments, color is sufficient. Now we can generalize this to other types of features. It's not likely, it's almost certain that color and shape are not the only features that guide goal-directed search. So in one current project, we are using VR in conjunction with computer vision models to augment this feature space with features that are not as easily separable, but may nevertheless be relevant for human behavior. For example, perceptual features, but also semantic features, contextual features, affordances about what people can do with every object and so on. Okay, so I'm going to take the last few minutes and describe some implications for the work I presented today for the study of mood disorders. So there's some interesting work in reinforcement learning models of mood that suggests that our mood tracks a recency weighted average of reward prediction errors. So what I mean by that is that when the environment exceeds our expectations, our mood tends to improve, while when the environment is worse than we expected, our mood decreases. And rewards also seem better to us in a good mood and worse in a bad mood. And this kind of interaction between mood and learning is thought to underlie cycles of mood instability. Now we can show in simulation that when we have composite stimuli, so in this example, this compound has two different features, A and B, and the expectations about these features actually differ. Different attentional biases, so different ways in which we can attend to one feature or another, can lead to different mood dynamics, even when the outcome sequence experienced by the model in this case is exactly the same. So in other words, when attention is biased towards certain parts of the environment, the sequence of prediction errors changes, leading to different mood dynamics. Now, this is a toy model, but still has some interesting implications for how mood and attention interact in the real world. So in an empirical study that I'm currently doing, my collaborator and I were interested in looking at how people's propensity to attend to different parts of the environment changes as a function of mood. So we induced people to be in a happy versus sad mood and found that happy mood biased people's attention towards positive expectations. And negative mood biased people's attention towards negative expectations. And importantly, we actually were able to tease those two processes apart computationally, which actually might allow us in the future to study how these mood dynamics may interact with attentional biases in naturalistic environments. So I'm hopeful that a better understanding of decision-making in naturalistic environments can actually help us design closed-loop therapeutic systems that, for example, might nudge people towards features of the environment that promote healthy mood states. And I am excited to forge collaborations that may help bring in ideas from human-computer interaction and robotics to help us pursue this angle further. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thank you to my collaborators and funding sources.
Thank you so much for Angela and Lydia for the two exciting talks. For audience members, you can feel free to put your questions in Q&A. Also, you can also try, if you want to talk, you can also raise your hand using the raise hand function. Raise your hand and we'll call on you. So this is very much the beginning of a conversation, really. And the hope is to find people who have similar interests across the 7 data science institutes and develop ideas and develop new collaboration relationships. So you can ask questions, or if you want to talk about how their research is related to yours, that would be great too. So please feel free to either raise your hand or put questions down. So I think the first question is for you, Lydia. Can you see that in the Q&A?
I have some trouble seeing the Q&A. I don't know why. Would you mind reading the question?
Yeah, so it's have actuators, including motors and effectors, etc., kept up with advancements in robotics?
So this is a very interesting question. There is a lot happening right now, especially now with new materials. I'm totally impressed with with the advances I see in soft robotics. Have they kept up? I mean, we always want more and more. I mean, we want more reliable actuation. You know, we want smaller, lighter devices. We want everything. I think, however, that what has happened in the last few years is just amazing. I mean, the reliability of the hardware has increased tremendously. Also the capabilities have increased tremendously. Now and the price has dropped, okay, which is very important, especially for academics. It's very important that the price has dropped, because before there were some systems that were $500,000. It's impossible for a small lab to acquire such a system. But now the prices are not a few thousand, but they are significantly cheaper than before. I think it is. I see them as moving in tandem. Also, advances in hardware inspire us. When we see what is happening with soft robotics, or what is happening with gecko robots, climbing robots, we think about new ways of using these devices. And I would not put virtual reality or augmented reality, outside robotics. Actually, in robotics, we do use augmented reality very often to instruct our robots, because who wants to say, go to XYZ and specify XYZ, right? You want to tell the robot, pick up this object, show somehow the robot this object and have it picked up. And many of the experiments that we are doing in order to get to that is actually through augmented reality, which is very interesting, how you collect experiences through this for people specifying tasks, for example, in our case. And how would somebody like Angela be able to use all this data that we are gathering for a different purpose? But it is, I find it fascinating, the interactions that exist right now, many of which are enabled by, hardware advances.
I just want to mention that question is from Igor Alvarado.
Okay, thank you, Igor, for your question. And you can feel free to be in touch with me if you would like more details. So can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
I mean, it's a question for Angela mainly, but also for the audience if they want to reply. So Angela, if you had the data, if you were collecting the data that you are collecting through different modalities, do you think your results would change, or do you think you can have further insight to what you are to the inference that you're doing right now?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a wonderful question. I think so. I think the insight, the theoretical insights, and this idea of sampling information and how information can be used to achieve goals and so forth. I think that's a generalizable principle across different modalities. But people learn from many different sources of information, and we know that. And the question is, how do we know that? For the question that we're interested in, how do we know that we've included all the relevant features that someone might be thinking about? It's definitely, it's not the case that if we study virtual reality, we've automatically included everything. But I think there are interesting manipulations to be done there, where we actually change the environment in subtle ways and understand how the presence and absence of different features can change the things that people actually think about. And that's it's a question more of how to analyze the richness of those data. I mean, we focus on behavioral tasks in which the behavior is very clear and easy to analyze, but in real world scenarios, people actually use many different kinds of features to drive behavior. And I think that's an exciting place where data science can actually help us make sense of this more complicated data.
So I don't see more questions coming in. Just one more reminder that you can put questions in Q&A, or you can raise your hand to if you want to just speak up. If we don't have questions in the next 30 seconds-ish, I think we can just wrap up. This is one of the first, this is the first this kind of collaboration pitch. So the hope is that the conversation doesn't just stop here. And some of the audience members signed up ahead of time, so we have your contact information, and we'll reach out to ask if anybody has ideas to discuss with the group. So, okay, so again, thank you very much for both of you for the wonderful talk, and yeah, so there's a note in the chat. I want to make sure Angela and Lydia both see it. It's about connecting with Black women in artificial intelligence. So that'll be great if we make the connection. So with that, thank you everyone for speakers and for attending the talk.
Thank you very much for organizing, and to all the people who attended.
Thank you for organizing. Yeah.
Okay, bye everyone.